Support for the podcast comes from Pediatric Psychology Center of Chester County. At their locations in Exton and Downingtown, Pennsylvania, they offer assessment and therapy for neurotypical and neurodivergent children, teens, young adults, and their family members. They believe that finding a perfect fit between client and clinician is of utmost importance and will work to make sure that you are expertly matched, even if that means connecting you with another office. Learn more at chesterpsychology.com. Hello and welcome back to Parenting Stuff I Wish I Knew Sooner and Want You to Know Now. I'm your host, Erica Desper, founder of the Center for Confident Parenting and a mom who seems to learn everything I need to know the hardest way and well after I need to know it. I'm on a mission to help you avoid the same. Today, my guest is Zoe Darazsdi. Hopefully I said that right. I did not ask you.
You did.
We did so much prep and I didn't ask you how to say your last name. Good. A mental health counselor who specializes in empowering neurodiverse people. She has helped countless teens and adults navigate the challenges and the gifts of living with a unique brain. Zoe's work is supported by her own autistic self-advocacy and the professional research she conducts on autistic people's experiences in counseling. Zoe, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yes. So I think when I learned about you, I didn't have like a full picture of my own kiddo. And now that I circled back to you, I do. So this topic is even more relevant. So I'm excited to hear what you have to share with us today. First, tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what brought you to this work, all that good stuff.
Sure. So I am a clinical mental health counselor. I have a private practice that specializes in working with autistic, ADHD teens and adults. And I also branch out a bit into sort of support groups and coaching for the neurotypical parents of neurodivergent children. Mm-hmm. So a lot of what brought me here is my own autism and my own ADHD. I have had jobs working with the neurodivergent community since I was like very young, and I've always felt like a kinship. And then I was sort of informally diagnosed by a therapist at the age of 19, and I was like, well, that would track, right?
You're like, oh, that explains everything.
Right, yeah, like how in the past I was always able to really accurately predict what, like an autistic child I was nannying needed, and people were like, but how? And I was like, well, it's what I would need, right?
Right.
Since then, I've really dedicated a lot of my life and career to research, advocacy, and counseling with my community.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So one of the things I would love for you to help us understand today, and by us, I mean everyone who's listening, but particularly, as you mentioned, parents with neurotypical brains parenting a kid, or some have multiple kids with neurodivergent brains. So what is it you have said, I'll read a quote from your website, one of the hardest parts of being neurodiverse is living in a world full of people who don't get you. Mm-hmm. This can make us neurodiverse folks feel rejected, alone, and unworthy. So that's clearly hard for us to feel or picture unless we have for some reason. Can you expand on what is it like to navigate a neurotypical world when you aren't?
Yeah, so I think that a really foundational element of this is the idea that, so the world was built by the majority, the neurotypical majority, right? And so many of the issues that autistic people come up against are really based in our environment and the attitudes of our society. So things like, why are grocery stores so bright? So loud and so awful.
And loud.
Yeah, every time I'm in there and I see people sort of buzzing around, doing their thing, I'm like, do you not viscerally feel how awful this is? I guess not. Or there's just many systems of communication, specifically, how people are almost never direct or blunt in their speech. And, they speak in this really indirect way. Like they'll ask you a question, but that's not the real question they're asking you. So there's just like so much inference. And it makes many conversations really like challenging for neurodivergent people in a way that it feels like, why is this challenging? Why is this being made so hard? I think that perhaps one of the worst parts of that is that, especially if you are a neurodivergent person who could present or pass as neurotypical, we are often, our like autistic ADHD traits are misattributed to character flaws.
Mm.
So like many times in my life, I've just said something very directly, good intentions, like really coming from a kind place. I'm just trying to communicate. And then the people around me have been like, wow, the level of directness with which you said that was very rude. You're clearly trying to be antagonistic. And that's always shocking. That's like for me to
I knew you were probably trying to
receive
be
that
honest and
feedback.
forthright.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so it's kind of a lifetime of many little things building up that just make it feel like, as an autistic person, there's like a glass wall between yourself and other people. And it's very hard. Like you can see them and they can see you, but the contact is difficult to make, you know?
Yeah. And we experienced this recently. My son and I don't have a diagnosis of neurodivergence, but I would call a highly sensitive person. Maybe I'm just undiagnosed, or I'm sure you can be highly sensitive without the diagnosis. I have a really hard time in certain environments. So my son and I just recently were at a store that will stay unnamed. No, it won't. It was Five Below. And he had a $5 gift card to use, actually, that a therapist gave him. And normally, what kid wouldn't be thrilled to have like $5 free, go into Five Below, get anything you want. He couldn't, he was like, I'm not getting anything. And I'm like, you're not getting anything? We kept coming to each other. Like we'd separate and look around and come back and be like, why is the music so loud? And of course, the selection that it was also just very like in your face. I couldn't, like, we both were like, let's just get out of here. And I thought, wow, like they truly don't get it. They think they're making it a fun shopping experience, but like, he couldn't even evaluate the choices,
Yeah,
or form thoughts, and they lost his money, right? Which I think that was like a perfect example of what you're describing. Clearly, everyone else can do what they need to do and want to do in there without that stopping them. It felt like a big deal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that something that has been really challenging is when you have a neurotypical person and a neurodivergent person, and they're in a relationship, that's called a cross neurotype relationship.
Okay.
And the vast majority of the societal attitudes and the attitudes of the mental health field for decades now has been that, autistic people need to do whatever it takes to become neurotypical. So when you have like an autistic kid and a neurotypical parent, or, an ADHD kid and a neurotypical parent, the ADHD kid is basically just trying to learn how to pass as neurotypical. And this is considered a really good thing because it enables them to access a far higher degree of privilege in our society. Because there's a ton of privilege that comes with just being seen as normal, like a ton. And even sometimes like in the parent-child relationship a little bit, like it's considered that, for example, there's a lot of kids who went through therapy to be able to tolerate their parents giving them these long hugs. And that was considered like something that the child should like work up to and train themselves to do. And the argument was like, well, this is how your mom loves you and other people are going to want to hug you. But, when something is sensory overwhelming, the autistic or ADHD brain actually perceives it as a physical pain. So if you think about it that way, what that does to the relationship is that in order to be like the child, in order to be in relationship to the parent, has to be hurting. You has to be working really hard. Cannot come as you are. And so there's like a kind of a new attitude. Milton published something called the double empathy problem in 2012. And it's this attitude that basically says like, let's compromise. So it might feel like love to the parent to give a hug. It just feels like pain to the kid, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's not beneficial mutually. And it might actually strain your relationship.
Right.
But like, what is there otherwise that you could do that is not sensory overwhelming to the kid, but is this like mutual way of showing affection?
Right. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Interesting. So that brings me to another question. You've also said that when we go to therapy for these problems, we're often met by a neurotypical therapist who doesn't understand us either. So now we have like society maybe doesn't understand us. Maybe our parents don't quite understand us yet, but they know that we need support. So they send us to therapy. Um, and to continue your quote, the same issues we experience in society are then perpetuated in our relationship with our therapist, making mental health care ineffective and damaging. So it sounds like if you are the parent of a neurodivergent child, teen, young adult, you need to be really incredibly careful with who you seek out for mental health support for that reason.
Yeah, I think that a big sort of way in which the mental health field has really like misled the parents of neurodivergent kids is in having these goals that are very much based in eradicating the neurodivergence.
Mm-hmm.
Autism, ADHD, those are value neutral but inherent parts of a person. They're not an illness, they're a neurotype. They're part of your brain. And when many of your interactions with your child are focused on eradicating something that they do, like, for example, stimming, like flapping your hands or
Mm-hmm.
jumping around, which is like what you do when you're happy and excited a lot of the time, or what you do to make yourself calm and functional. When a lot of the therapy and the sort of carry home, like, the way that the family can support the therapy is to eradicate behaviors like that and to focus a lot of the way that the parent views the child as like, I gotta fix you.
Mm-hmm.
That does not communicate like unconditional love and unconditional positive regard, right? Um, and so I think like any time that a kid is working with a therapist and the therapist is targeting behavior, for starters, if the therapist is going at your child with an exclusively behavioral approach that doesn't take into consideration, first and foremost, your kid's feelings, their thoughts, and how they emotionally attach to other people, that I think is a red flag.
Mm-hmm.
But also, um, the question is like, is it healthy? Is it functional? So if we're going to have any strategies, right? Um, Anything that you make a goal around, any behavior you want to change, has to be something that is like not functional or not healthy, a thing that the kid would have actual buy-in to want to change,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, for example, and when I say like, is it healthy? I mean, like, is it safe? Does it result in illness?
Right.
When I say, is it functional? I mean, could you go about your day this way and still do the necessary things to maintain life?
Mm-hmm.
Could you be in society this way and not hurt yourself and other people?
Mm-hmm.
If so,
Right.
right, then a lot of other things are kind of secondary. And a big part of what happens with neurodivergent people is that sometimes in our therapy, especially when we're children, something that is healthy and functional, just odd, right, just unusual, is targeted and prioritized as a main problem behavior.
So the stimming we could use as an example of like,
Yeah.
you can do that and life is still gonna go on.
Yeah, exactly. And there's, nuance to it in the sense that, like, I have met some, like, for example, like okay, I've met teenage Black boys who live in areas with very high police presence, and their stim is to jump up and do like a tuck jump.
Mm-hmm.
And so at times, because once again, of like societal factors outside of the control of the person that are unfair to the person, there needs to be like caveats or like some
Hmm.
education around the
Yeah.
stimming so that, a person understands,
Doesn't put them at risk.
yeah.
Hmm.
But, for the most part, like if a stim is healthy and functional, okay, let's leave that alone. Let's actually focus on the fact that, like, it seems like you have a lot of anxiety in certain circumstances. And, the stimming is one way of coping with it. But, like, what's making you so anxious about
Right.
this or this situation? Um, Questions like that and therapeutic goals like that make a person feel way more seen than
Yeah.
goals that are exclusively about, here's how your autistic behavior is making me uncomfortable, and so I would like it changed, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So having this group that I am parent group that I'm the admin of, I often see parents asking, where can I find a provider who is, neurodiversity affirming, informed, all that stuff. Clearly you are an option that parents can seek out, and I'll let everyone know how to find you in the description of this episode. But is there a way, a website or somewhere parents can go to say, like, I want to make sure that I'm only finding people that get this? Or is that so specialized? It's just like, do your homework and ask questions.
Yeah, I think that one of the challenges right now is that there isn't enough of like an organized hub, right?
Right.
But there are like things that you could look at as sort of like red flags or things you would
Mm.
want to stay away from.
Hmm.
So, if on the website for like a provider, they talk about like autism and ADHD as like almost like a disease, or they talk about it as like not just a difference, but like a thing that has to be like fundamentally changed.
Hmm.
There are certain organizations also, like larger organizations such as Autism Speaks, that
Mm.
have not been well received by autistic self
Hmm.
advocates because they have done things like compare autism to cancer.
Mm.
However, they have the best SEO. Like
Mm.
if you found out your kid's autistic and you type into Google autistic kid, what do I do? Um,
Right.
they're going to be the first page of
Yeah.
Google because they have a lot of resources. So, that's kind of the conundrum, like the really difficult place that a lot of parents are in with their kids.
Yeah.
Um, and I think it has to be like, before sort of sending your kid somewhere, like a real conversation with the individual therapist that your child would be working with to
Hmm.
discuss, like, well, what are you like? Let's make sure that we both have a shared understanding of like what this therapy is actually intended for.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. Your tagline for your business is creating your unique identity and narrative in a neurotypical world. What does that mean to you? You've clearly had time to become an adult and figure a lot of this out. Um, yeah, how would you expand on that?
Yeah, so I think that a big aspect of that is that the neurodivergent community, like autistic and ADHD people, have had their story told extensively by people who are not in their community, but
Hmm.
and like there are preset narratives for that are
Hmm.
pretty limiting for us or that just don't feel entirely accurate, honestly. And much of the time we go through life masking or attempting to hide our like autistic ADHD traits. Um, and a lot of people say, well, what's wrong with masking? It sounds like that would be a good thing. I want my kid to have an easy life, so I want them to appear as normal as possible.
Hmm.
But what people don't realize, but the research indicates, is that masking is extremely exhausting. So
Hmm.
like hiding your autism takes a ton of work, and it's correlated to really high rates of suicidality, autistic burnout, depression, and anxiety. The
Hmm.
last thing we want to do is create social structures in a kid's life where they feel like I have to mask with my family. I have to mask like in all my social circles. Um, because you can imagine if you were like pretending essentially to be different than you were, or like suppressing a lot of things about yourself, how lost you might feel,
Mhm.
or how like unwanted as who you are you might feel. And so it's just like a really different uh, like way of looking at things. And I feel a lot for neurotypical parents because I think that we see how like as a society, for example, there's a lot of TV shows that make autistic traits the punchline of a joke, right?
Mhm.
And there's a lot of people who we might know in a community or something. I mean, a lot of times, like you look back at like the weird kid at high school, right? That was probably like an autistic kid, whether or not they
Yeah.
knew it. Um, like you look at the traits, and so autistic people, our brains are the best at pattern recognition.
Mhm.
When an autistic kid sees you kind of like judging or laughing at or critiquing
Mhm.
autistic traits, even something so much as like, wow, that's an adult man who's really into trains. Like that guy's super weird.
Mm.
Okay, that's probably a special interest. Your kid, as someone who's awesome at pattern recognition, is sitting there going like, that's like me.
Right.
So you don't even have to say something cruel to your kid. The fact that like there's
Then
this
they could be internalizing what you said.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned earlier on the challenges and the gifts. I have a couple questions for you now that I didn't give you in advance. So hopefully that doesn't throw you off. What else would you list as the gifts of being neurodivergent? Because, of course, we are so heavily focused on the challenges and the deficits and all of that, but there are some beautiful things that come with this. Pattern recognition, I guess, could work for you or against you.
Yeah, so a big aspect of neurodivergence, which results in a lot of neurodivergent people being innovators in their fields, is something called bottom up thinking.
Hmm.
So, this might be why, you might notice that your child takes a really long time to make choices, that your child looks at things and makes their choices differently than you would expect them to. And just the different ways they see things is because neurodivergent people, we look at all of the little details and we put them together to form an understanding of something. Neurotypical people often see something and they make like an assumption about
Hmm.
that thing, and then other stuff fills in the details. So, like a lot of the times, neurodivergent people are intuitively aware of social customs. So they'll just like do something, right? Because they like,
Hmm.
you guys are like programmed, um,
Right.
neurotypical people, we might not have that awareness. Um, but we are like really aware of like a lot of other things that are going on. Um,
Hmm.
and so it's like just you know, this is how scientific discoveries are made, right?
Right.
Seeing something in a new way, seeing details other people didn't, and figuring out how they factor in. This is how a lot of genuine connection happens.
Hmm.
Seeing a person, seeing their little details and their behaviors, and like actually understanding them rather than having an assumption about them. I think that's a really beautiful thing.
Yeah.
I think another thing is that often autistic people are incredibly genuine and honest, and sometimes that's not always socially advantageous, but like it is so like inherently good.
Hmm.
um,
Yeah.
and
And
often,
successful, I would say to parents, if parents are maybe just receiving the diagnosis and are feeling the challenges, the deficits, whatever that mindset, like go learn about and have your child learn about all the incredibly successful people, notable people. I'm sure there's successful people that we don't know their names. Temple Grandin comes to mind, and lots of other people that just, changed the world in a
mhm,
positive way.
yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. I didn't ask you this in advance either, but you talked about masking and how exhausting that is, not to mention, unfair and lots of other things. In your clinical experience, in your personal experience, do you think that that can be processed as a trauma? And I'm thinking of our family's scenario. We didn't know our son's diagnosis until the end of seventh grade. So he masked for all of those years. Actually, part of why it was so hard to get the diagnosis and the supports was that he relied so heavily on his strengths, and his strengths are so strong that until it got really complex and all of that, it was hard for anyone to see it other than us. So it's been a long journey, but I look back and think like, wow, no wonder he was falling apart, like every morning anticipating and then every afternoon exhausted. uh, that has to be traumatic on some level. I mean, I know there's different levels of trauma, but what would you say to that?
Yeah, I think that masking activates the nervous system
Mm-hmm.
in ways that the body is not capable of keeping up with. And so, like, trauma is really the definition of it, is that something like occurs to you, happens to you, that your brain and your body are not able to sufficiently cope with,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so when you look at masking all day, every day, being in a school that is just so overstimulating, and kind of sitting there and pretending you're not overstimulated, and just like endlessly checking yourself, like, am I,
Mm-hmm.
sitting right? Is my face right? Am I doing the right thing? Which, by the way, if you're asking yourself those questions, you're probably not actually learning very much.
Right.
Or you're learning.
Where's the room to hear and process?
Yeah. And then, if a person makes a mistake and they're masking, the correction is swift and cruel, right? It's
Mm.
like horrendous bullying. And it's also like a lot of punitive measures taken by teachers.
Sure.
Like, there were many times when I would get in trouble for something that I I was like so confused as to why I was getting in trouble. It was assumed that I was trying to be like difficult somehow.
Right.
Um, and so at that point, when your child gets home from school, they are probably so tired. We have something called like post restraint collapse.
Yes.
They get home and they do not want to be bothered.
Which is sometimes also called after school restraint collapse, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. They just are done. They want to lay down. They don't necessarily want to do any more communicating. They've been doing that all day. And they don't necessarily like any additional sort of task demands might be met with like a bit of attitude, because they're like,
because here we are like, how was your day? Yeah, tell me what happened, all these things, and like, let's start homework. And
yeah,
they're like, ah. Yeah, for sure.
yeah, yeah. How was your day, by the way, is too vague of a question, too broad. A lot more success in making it more specific. But
Yes. Well, and we'll come back to that because I am going to ask you what other things do you want us to know. But let me go back to before that. One thing you said about, you would get in trouble for something and you didn't, it was assumed that maybe you were being difficult. As the parent of a neurodiverse kiddo who is also turning 14, and I'm sorry, Bud, that I keep talking about you on here. Hopefully you'll never listen to this. It's very hard for me, or I should say us as co-parents, to decide in the heat of the moment, look, is he just being like this because he's a 14-year-old boy and it's hormones and he's just like giving us a really hard time, and this has like nothing to do with any of the diagnoses, in which case I would lean probably more towards like a stern, punitive, whatever. Or is this like, it was not intentional. He doesn't totally grasp, everything involved. This is more about being an autistic person, in which case maybe I'd lean more toward like teaching and patience. It's like a constant struggle, I think, within me. And then from like parent to parent, we don't always see eye to eye. So having grown up that way yourself and being parented, what do you want us as parents to know in those moments where we're assuming our child's motives for something, or we're trying to decide, like, is it this or is it that? I mean, does it even matter?
yeah, I think that there's a lot of sometimes upfront assumption from people that an autistic kid knows, or an ADHD kid like knows the impact of their behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And you can share the impact of that in a way that isn't like accusatory. So for example, if there's a kid who comes downstairs every morning and like doesn't even like acknowledge their family at all, and like that's considered pretty rude.
Rude.
There's if it really matters to you, like if that when that happens to you, you feel like kind of triggered or hurt or upset. First, like ask yourself, like, why is it upsetting? But if it is upsetting, like you have the right, you have feelings too, But the way to go about it is not necessarily to say, you are so rude, like you come down here every morning and like not even a hello, not even a good morning for us. If a person is just like waking up and not even realizing that there's the social expectation of saying hello, they're baffled by that. But if you say like, hey, and in the morning, I am really happy to see you. I know you're just waking up, but it would mean a lot to me if in the morning we could just like say some hellos and everything and acknowledge each other. Because then I feel like I don't get to see you when you're at school. So I just want to like make a little contact with you in the morning. Okay. Now we know, right? What you're feeling. And so that's a lot easier to work with.
Yeah. And this brings us back to something we talked about on a different episode, is that with the neurodivergent brain, things that are maybe implicit for another brain need to be said, taught, practiced, reiterated explicitly. And that sounds like what you were just doing.
Yeah. And it also really helps to know the values, the reasoning behind something. Like if a person, shame and guilt get autistic people and ADHD people pretty far in life, as far as like, oh, let me amend my behavior out of shame and guilt, right? But often, eventually, there's apathy. There's like, well, what? Like, none of this makes sense to me. Why do I give a shit? So an integral skill for us is to learn to make values-based decisions. So it's like, it's not going to be sustainable to make decisions based on like, this is what's normal and I feel embarrassed for not doing it. It's much better for us to make decisions based on like, this fits my values. And the values-based decision-making is a super important, I think, thing that you could like model that would help a neurodivergent kid throughout their life, right? So if one of your values is like empathy, and you understand that it's not just about the fact that like you came in the door and you threw all your stuff down and you went to your room. It's that like when mom sees that, it feels pretty hurtful because it just feels like you dumped a mess there for her and you don't want to talk to her. And maybe you're overwhelmed, but like, this is why I need you to like hang your stuff up before you go upstairs. It's not like a behavioral thing necessarily. Like, I'm not trying to do this, because I think that you're a little, because you didn't do it. It's just like, this is what makes this hard for the people around you. That is so much more easy, one, to remember, because now I remember like why I'm supposed to be doing this. Yeah. And now I feel like, oh yeah. Like, I don't want to like just be rampantly cruel. Like, of course, I'll hang
right. Because my son's going to think like, well, I don't mind my stuff all over. I actually maybe like it like that. So you're just hassling me. So I need to explicitly help him understand like, well, I have trouble with visual clutter. So that stresses me out. And then the story I'm telling myself is that you don't care and you're leaving it for me to pick up. But he won't just know all of that. Yeah, that's great to know. What other things would you love parents raising neurodivergent kids, particularly if the parent is neurotypical themselves or both of them are, to know?
I think something that often like kind of slips through the cracks, but is super integral to the autistic experience are special interests. So,
which we often call fixations, right? But we shouldn't.
Right, exactly. That really like pathologizes them. But
let's change our language there. Let's stress that special interests, parents. That's what we're saying.
Yeah, like a child might have this special interest. Special interests are like, okay, when an autistic person is upset, they're really, really upset, right? But when we're happy, we have access to tremendous joy. I often just view like autistic people as having like a wider emotional range in many ways,
Mm-hmm.
even if their facial expression or their outward behavior doesn't express it in a way that
Mm-hmm.
you might recognize. So special interests are really important to helping autistic people be happy. A lot of like people with ADHD also really fixate on things in a way that is like positive, like makes them happy. Um, Often a thing that I see is like, okay, so for example, my special interest is Halloween. Always has been. I If I turn this camera around, you would see that this office is full of Halloween decorations.
It's always Halloween, even when it's not October.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. And I think something that my parents did that was really positive for me is that they really supported that.
Mm-hmm.
And they could have looked at it like, oh, this looks kind of goth and like it's weird, or they could have looked at it like, this is a little bit embarrassing. It's March and yet you want to have like a bat decoration in your room.
Right.
But instead they were really positive toward that.
Mm-hmm.
And there can come a time where if your kid's special interest is something that is not going to be considered socially acceptable, so especially if it's immature, right? Considered immature.
Right.
One, a person's maturity is not directly correlated to their special interest. I'm interested in a holiday that I guess is for kids, but
Right.
I'm also like a competent adult. So,
Right.
that's not like a really scary indicator that your kid's not going to grow up appropriately. But also, it's a great thing for you to bond with your kid over and like let them just kind of info dump about it sometimes, engage with them in it. And when it comes a time for your kid where your kid might experience social repercussions for their special interest, I think it's important to have a conversation about that is like really helps them to understand that you appreciate their perspective. So instead of something like having you be like, Zoe, you are getting to be way too old for this Halloween thing. This is middle school now, and the other kids are really going to start making fun of you. Instead of that, say, Zoe, I think it's really wonderful that you love Halloween. I love to see how much joy this brings you. I want to forewarn you that, and maybe you've started to notice this already, who knows, some of the other kids might be jerks about this because, they're in this process of like becoming less interested in that stuff. And sometimes people can be very judgy about these things. I wanted you to know that because I wanted you to be able to make an informed decision. If you choose to just like continue to share your Halloween stuff with whoever, whenever, I support that. That's like based on your values, that's your choice. If you want to like not share it with certain people because you don't trust them to be kind about it, I support that too. I think everyone should be kind. But, that's just the way it rolls. Right? That's like a much more like it helps the kid to feel like you guys are on the same team.
Yeah,
which is important when they feel like other people are not on their team. Maybe like in society, people are not always on their team.
What A, is this appropriate? And B, if so, what language? Like, I think you sharing the actual scripts is super, super helpful for me and hopefully for others as well. You mentioned info dumping, which like I get really excited when my son does that. I view it the way you said of like, I see how much joy this brings you. I know nothing about it. Honestly, I couldn't care less. but the fact that it makes him so happy and that he's memorized all this information, like I love that. But I could see how if he went to maybe tell one of his best friends about it, like they're going to be like, A, I don't care. B, you talk about this all the time. Like enough is enough already. So is it fair to say it is part of the social coaching we can do with our kids to say like, hey, not everyone may want to hear about this particular topic to this degree all of the time so that they're hearing that from someone safe who can phrase it like carefully. Let me do the first half of the question and stop. Is that appropriate to explain to our kids like you just explained with the Halloween thing?
Yeah, I think that's appropriate to explain. And I think like great values tie in again, right? Like sometimes, if you talk at great length about something, the other person you're talking to might feel like you're not interested in them because you're not like
You're
talking
kind of
to
talking
them.
at them versus with.
Yeah, like you're not
Right.
asking them questions, you're not talking to them about something that you guys are both interested in, and
Hmm.
you're not like giving them a chance to share their own stuff.
Hmm.
So maybe like try to limit it to like three things, like three fun
Hmm.
facts or three things like that, and like pause and give the other person an option. And they can either respond to that or they might change the subject or something. But it just helps other people feel like you care and like you're listening
Right.
when you do
Okay.
it
That
that
was the second half was like, tell us what to say. So that was, that was great. Um, okay. What is one more thing that you've learned on your journey? And by your journey, I mean either your personal journey, or your professional journey, or both, that we you haven't mentioned yet that you definitely want other people, other parents, other autistic individuals, whatever you choose to know today.
Yeah, I think that a really primary thing is that like accountability be something that gets taken by everybody on all sides,
Mm,
right? So it seems like there can be a pendulum swing between like I really like feel like I need to hold my kid accountable in ways that are like often kind of strict or often kind of punitive, or I am just going to kind of let them do whatever, get away with whatever because they're neurodivergent. And either party is terrified of becoming the other, right? Um, I think when you think about like what is a reasonable expectation to have um, for like your child, like what are reasonable goals, we can think about what helps with like the family unit, what helps everybody to have a strong connection, because sometimes we might think, oh, we need to like really prioritize this neurodivergent child. Um, and there are like aspects to which like that's unavoidable because they might just have more
mhm.
needs than the other kids, more needs than, whatever. But as neurodivergent people get older, their family can be very important. And so like teaching them how to function within a family and like take into consideration the perspectives of other members of their family is really important and a huge growth point and helps them even make their own family one day.
Mm.
But also like, simultaneously, right? Dialectics, you hold two truths at once, simultaneously holding this understanding that a lot of the times, an ADHD behavior and autism behavior is not about, and it's just about the autism and ADHD, right? It's not like about targeting a person or upsetting a person. And so a really important step is to first kind of check in with yourself and think like, what is this triggering in me?
Mm.
Am I coming at this with like as neutral a perspective as I can to like really understand? Or am I coming at this already with like my own narrative where I'm like, this was very inconsiderate and I feel disrespected and this reminds me of other times in my life I was disrespected. Now I'm very
Mm.
mad. Like,
Right.
no.
Yeah. Oftentimes, or maybe always, our reaction, our initial reaction is something that's getting triggered either from our own childhood or
Oh
maybe
yeah.
like you're acting rude. I've not done a good job parenting you or something
Right.
like that, right?
Yeah.
In our family, we try to start hard conversations, and this is from Brene Brown. The story I'm
Mm-hmm.
telling myself is that when you drop your stuff by the door, you don't care that I'm going to have to pick it up
Yeah.
later, and you don't care that visual clutter makes me really anxious. And that way he gets the chance to say like, what? No, 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 no way. I just like, really wanted to get on the couch and get on my phone and get under the blanket and snuggle the cats or whatever. So that's, hey, everyone can borrow that. It's not mine. It's Renee's. I love her. Awesome. This was so, so helpful. I will definitely have you back to dig into all of this more. But Zoe, thank you for joining me today. Listeners and watchers, I will, of course, be back soon with more stuff that I and others, parents, professionals, wish that we knew sooner, want you to know sooner. In the meantime, I'll leave you with my list of stuff I've learned the hardest way. Your to do list will always be there. So make sure you put yourself on it, ideally not at the bottom. You can't pour from an empty cup. So schedule ways to refill yours every day, even if they are short, small, whatever it may be. And there is no way to be a perfect parent, countless ways to be a really, really good one. So let's aim for that. And hopefully, this podcast is helping a little bit. And we'll be back soon. Thanks, everybody, for listening.